Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Radiology AI, the Evolution of a Revolution. Today's program is sponsored by Philips. Thanks so much to our sponsor and to you and our audience for giving us your time and attention today. My name is Mark Haglund. I'm the editor-in-chief of Healthcare Innovation magazine. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details to share with you. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of the program. For technical issues, please press F5 to refresh. And if that doesn't work, you can submit a question with your issue through the Q&A panel. Finally, join our webinar conversation on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag HILiveWebinar. Thank you very much. And we will be holding questions until the last 10 minutes of the hour after our presenter has completed his presentation and he and I have dialogued for a short period of time. But please go ahead and submit your questions as he is presenting. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's program. Kevin Love is a marketing director for advanced visualization and AI solutions at Philips. His career has focused on bringing to market innovative medical technologies for 15 years. During his 5 years at Philips, he has been responsible for various launches of the IntelliSpace portal advanced visualization platform and is the recipient of a Philips Innovation Award. Kevin holds an MBA from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management with a focus on biotechnology marketing. And with that, Kevin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mark, and welcome everybody to the presentation. I hope you'll come off a little bit more informed. The space of AI is changing almost on a daily basis, so it's always great to try and keep ourselves more informed. One of the ways that I learn about it as well is by creating presentations and sharing a bit of knowledge as much as I've got as well. So we'll go through, and I think what we're going to try and do is explore the progression of AI and whether or not we've really reached a tipping point in the adoption of AI across healthcare in particular and in radiology in particular. Hopefully we'll see if we've gotten to a tipping point and maybe some of the challenges along the way. So just for the purposes of this presentation, I'd like to note that artificial intelligence has very, very broad definitions. There's multiple different methodologies associated with artificial intelligence. People use the terminologies, things like machine learning and deep learning, but really it's generally the science and engineering of creating machines or computer programs that try to mimic basically what in our case, the radiology is trying to accomplish. And there's a host of different methods that can accomplish that. Machine learning and deep learning are just two of them, even though they're the ones who are typically very often referred to. For our purposes, I think that we have to expand out that definition because there's more and more methods that are coming out all the time, even within these sub-definitions. And I think basically what we're going to try and look at is the more insightful ways of doing radiology, more insightful ways of getting at a diagnosis, using a host of different methods that are computer augmented in order to be able to give a more holistic view. So, we see projections like this all the time, right? Especially in new markets, especially in markets that are growing, where there's a high level of anticipation for where the market can be going. This is a more recent one where they talk about the general exponential growth that existed. It's a little bit older by now, but they projected that there'll be 11-fold increase, roughly a 40% year-on-year growth rate in AI applications within healthcare. And honestly, having been in this space for a little while, it's not like we're seeing the projections really coming to fruition at the same rate that we've been seeing. Projections like this come from a couple of different sources. And I'd like to explore why, because it sounds like the market is growing rather rapidly, and I'd like to explore whether or not that's really true. Well, it could really be true if we take a look at the general host of different applications that you could use for artificial intelligence within healthcare. And by the way, some of these are still coming to fruition. Some of them are not necessarily have not necessarily reached a tipping point or have been become into common usage. But there's a host of different potential capabilities for which the market, the way we're defining the market, might be looked at. Either operational optimization, where we're taking a look at things like patient scheduling, or ways to empower the patients themselves, which we at Philips are also looking at, decision support or population health management. But for the purposes of our presentation, I thought what we'd take a look at is diagnostic imaging. And part of the reason for why is because if you take a look at just the world of diagnostic imaging, there's a host of different potential applications of AI. There's a lot of wealth in terms of the levels of diagnostic support. And generally speaking, I think it's a little bit more better understood than the way that AI can be implemented, looking at a couple of those other applications that we have spoken about. Because AI is so good at image recognition in particular, Google uses it, Apple uses it quite a bit in everyday applications. It lends itself to application within the radiology sphere in healthcare before pretty much any other usage. And you can actually see that because of the levels of different publications that have come out. So if we take a look at the progression of algorithm development, for instance, this is an article that had popped up again in reference that it wasn't actually too long ago. And I welcome you guys to take a look at each one of these references. They're all individually informative. But diagnostic imaging really holds the lion's share of the algorithm development that's out there. Yet if I take a look at the total investment in the radiology space in particular and the growth of the algorithms there, having spoken with a lot of the developers of third-party algorithms in particular, those growth rates are not really what they're actually seeing in the field as well. So maybe part of the reason for why is because there's a whole bunch of different other applications and the usage of AI within healthcare that's not strictly related, at least to the diagnostic component of radiology. For example, this is a project that we actually ran together in Philips to use AI capabilities in order to try and predict no-shows. Okay, this is our opportunity and the intent to try and use analytics and AI-driven analytics to look at things like and factors like patient age and past behavior to try and predict whether or not people were going to attend their radiology exams on time or not, and hopefully find ways to be able to help those who we predicted that were going to likely default or not come to their scan, try and get there by sending them cabs or sending them reminders, etc. So this is one potential usage, and another potential usage that we can look at are technology like we have. One of the technologies we use in our MR scanners is called VitalEye, which is an opportunity to use informatics and intelligence in order to learn the breathing patterns of some of our patients to try and make sure that we get the best scan possible. So, here's a couple different examples where the usage of potential or AI might be contributing to that overall bigger number, but not necessarily in the world or the world of radiology in particular, or in the usage of diagnostic radiology. So to try and understand whether or not we're really at a tipping point, I thought we'd take a look at a little bit of history in terms of the progression of how these algorithms and how informed algorithms are really made their way. And we can go back almost as far back as the late 60s, where there was the intent to be able to use some of the computing power even back then with technology like Dendril, which is an algorithm that was written to help take a look at mass spectroscopy using of chemistry, which led to a program called MySyn, which was an early learning program that tried to diagnose and automate decision-making processes for organic chemistry using heuristics and a couple of different tools that we actually still use today. But that was an early definition. It was an early usage of trying to use technologies, which was kind of quiet for a little while in terms of how technologies were used. And then we started seeing the initial usage of computer automated design functionality with a little bit of the growth in computing, with the growth of some of the mainframe computers and the computing capability to start developing more hard coding rather than using AI, the capabilities in CAD functionality. Looking at things like breast applications, which was one of the first usages of it, And then, certain universities also tried to come out with applications such as hospital-acquired infections and using it to try and create educational tooling and adjust to what the learner might use. Even there was some even early applications or intent to be able to use certain technologies, which they called Babylon at the time, to try and help answer questions similar to the algorithms that are used today with WebMD, et cetera, to try and help consult doctors as well. So these are some of the early forays, but you can see that there was quite a gap between the 60s and 80s, which you might expect out of any early embedding technology. And in the 90s, we saw a certain, introduction of CAD functionality extended to other advanced visualization applications, trying to look at cancer detection and colon detection, et cetera. But it seemed like the progression was rather slow. It didn't seem like there was a whole lot going on, even from the early 60s into the 2000s. And part of the reason for why it started to pick up in the late 2000s was seemingly because of a high increase in the amount of compute power and infrastructure that would have allowed for the connectivity between hospitals and the ability to start transferring data between various different points in the hospital. Particularly in radiology and imaging, there's a lot of highly, call it heavy data. We're using lots and tons of megabytes of data that needs to be transferred rather quickly to try and get diagnosis. And in the 2000s, that was only the time when it started to begin to have the amount of compute power that you necessarily need in order to be able to start looking at using these more advanced technologies, learning technologies, and the ability to start looking at images in a deeper way. And that's why in the 2000s, that's when we really started seeing, or 2010s, I should say, really started picking up the usage of automation in radiology and having much more access. And now the turnaround time for a lot of these radiology exams is actually quite quick. So again, I ask the question, are we now at the point where we're going to start to see a tipping point with the gradual growth up until this point? Have we really reached a tipping point? So let's take a look at a couple of the different care areas. Seems like a lot of the focus has been on neoplasm, so looking at cancer applications, some nervous applications. Cancer makes a lot of sense because if you have a lot of imaging that's usually done, you have a lot of opportunities to be able to image patients over a longer period of time, which actually is very important if we're going to be able to use AI technologies, because it has to learn from a set of technologies and a set of images over time. What's interesting about this is to actually know the timeline. So you can see the timeline here starting only at about 2013, when we really start to see an uptick in the actual number of articles that we're starting to see. These are published articles in respectable journals where people are really starting to use the application of AI in a more controlled and peer-reviewed way. So definitely looking at this projection where you're taking a look at almost a logarithmic increase in the amount of total studies that have actually been done, it definitely would appear that we would be at a tipping point. It definitely would appear that the community, the clinical community, has really started to really look at this as a serious technology for the implementation at the bedside. That said, I'll throw a caveat out there. I've also been involved in some of the application of 3D printing in clinical practice, another very interesting technology. And taking a look at the 3D printing, there was a lot of articles that came out on 3D printing as well. Not nearly as many as have gone out in AI. That said, there was an increase as well, and it doesn't really seem that the world of 3D printing has really taken off as well. So just because you have an uptick in the clinical papers that have been published on AI doesn't necessarily mean that we have reached a tipping point in actual clinical use. So, one thing that I'd like to posit is a very interesting question. There's a huge concern with the total amount of medical errors that are out there. Okay, and I wonder, that they can lead to many deaths. And I wonder, in our community itself, in the clinical community, are we guilty of the same? And what I mean by that is that if we take a look at the world of healthcare informatics, for those who are students of English, really we focus very, very much on the noun of this sentence, which is the informatics, and healthcare, which is the adjective, almost falls a little bit by the wayside. Really what we should be looking for is more informed healthcare, okay? And really what we should be focusing on is the healthcare much more than the informatics. AI are just methodologies But are we really giving better healthcare, or can we really give better healthcare using all these different papers that we've actually seen? So that's the question that we'd like to ask. Are we really getting any closer to the implementation of AI within common clinical practice? And is it really making a difference to some of our patients? Well, if we take a look at the data, obviously, we have more data than we really know what to do with. And we have a bigger variety of settings in clinical care. We have more and more devices pumping out data. Whereas a CT scan just a few short years ago would have been a series of maybe 100 images. And now we're producing upwards of series of thousands of images on a single CT scan. We're producing data sets that can be up to a gigabyte large that have to transfer over. We have bigger populations. We have much more risk and more that we want to do with our healthcare. So it definitely seems like this is an industry that's ripe for having some form of external support in the form of AI. So it's not just that we have a lot of clinical papers that are working in the world of AI, but there's more and more of a concern that the amount of data that we have out there simply doesn't allow radiologists in particular to be able to process and manage all of that data and really have the opportunity to make sense out of it. We can actually see this in the total amount of data sizes. In the last couple of years, taking a look just over a 10-year period, a single person can create over 8 trillion bytes of data, which basically is more than the total amount of degrees of freedom on the planet. And I read actually a statistic that in today's day and age, we are creating about 1.7 megabytes worth of healthcare data for every person on the planet every hour. So we have way more data than we know what to do with. It definitely seems like we need some additional support in order to be able to make sure that we can overcome challenges of physician burnout, which we're hearing more and more, and just to manage the data so we can actually give a holistic diagnosis to the patient rather than just taking a look at giving a cursory glance. So, taking a look at some of the further expectations, there was an article that came out that by 2025, 90% of global hospitals would be delivering evidence-driven care through their in-house AI platforms. Okay, basically that all hospitals would be automated, that we would have AI driving a lot of patient care, not just within radiology but beyond. 2025 is not that far away, and we actually at Philips conducted a study of our customer base, and we asked them the same question. What are your plans of being able to implement AI in the upcoming years? This is a survey that was done just about a year ago at HIMSS, and it was interesting that the total amount of customers that had really no plan on implementing an AI in the next 2 years, meaning they were interested in it, but didn't necessarily have any immediate plan of implementing, was upwards of 85%. So we had a lot of customers that actually, even though they were interested in the technology, again, we're seeing a little bit of a dichotomy between a lot of clinical interest, a lot of interest from, or a lot of need from the amount of data that's being produced, but still no real concrete uptake in terms of customers that are really interested in investing. So if we look a little bit closer, and this was a study that was done very, very recently that was published right before a recent Congress in radiology, the tide seemed to have turned, okay? And the tide seemed to have turned a little bit because now we're taking a look at upwards of 90% of hospitals that are looking at the usage of artificial intelligence within healthcare. And actually, the majority of them, and a lot of the investment is actually going towards building the foundation. So people recognize that there's a lot of data that's going to have to transfer back and forth, and they're going to have to build the infrastructure to really get the benefits out of it. So we might not have necessarily reached a tipping point in the usage of AI clinically, but at least the hospitals are beginning to understand that they have to start building the infrastructure. They know that the wave is coming, and they know that there's going to have to be a lot more hospital buy-in to make this actually work. Interestingly, if we take a look at the total amount of projections that we talked about from the previous, one of the previous slides where we talked about a $6 billion investment, if we compare that, and again, this is data looking at North America, it's only 62% of hospitals that are looking at spending about $1 million in apps. So if we take a look at the total market size, roughly, let's say, 5,500 hospitals throughout the U.S., that's roughly, and only 62% of them, so it's roughly, let's say 3,000 or 3,000 hospitals throughout the U.S. those are the only ones that are actually looking to spend over about $1 million. So we're undershooting a lot of the projections, at least as far as the total market opportunity that's out there. Again, this might be an early indication of starting to invest, but it definitely seems like there's more investment in infrastructure than there is right now in terms of total clinical applications. So let's take a reflection now and take a look at a recent show. This is a show that just happened last week. The largest show, it used to be the largest show, medical show, clinical show anywhere in the world, which is the Radiology Society of North America. It's recently gotten a little bit lower in terms of its total sponsorship or total attendance, but still a very, very large show and one of the largest implementations or discussions around the usage of AI. They have an entire forum at this show, as you can see in the bottom screen, an entire hall dedicated strictly to the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare. And as we stated, the largest opportunity could actually still be within radiology. So let's take a look at some of the data coming back from there, because this is probably the best indication of the clinical community and their interest in the implementation of it in common clinical practice. Okay, we also were represented there. Philips had a booth, a main booth for a lot of our normal solutions, but we also had a booth in this AI forum to hear out our customers, to also talk with them and understand what they would be interested in terms of general clinical practice. So let's take a look at some of the statistics which might give an indication as to whether or not the clinical community is starting to use this technology. There were over 45 presentations in an AI showcase. This is basically the usage of people actually using AI in clinical practice. There was 5 hands-on workshops that were very well attended, and a lot of learning lab sessions as well. And there was a session book, which you can see on the right side of the screen there, which was taking a look at how many different clinical sessions, scientific sessions that existed on the usage, or at least the exposition of artificial intelligence within the clinical practice. And it was the largest pamphlet at the show by far. There were over 300 clinical sessions that were being discussed in artificial intelligence, and over 130 companies identifying as having something to do with artificial intelligence, and we were one of them as well. That said, about a month before this conference, we can still show that there's a lot of articles that are talking about AI having slow progress from concept to clinic. And a lot of the discussions and articles were still around concept and not necessarily being used in common clinical practice. So how is it that we're seeing part of this dichotomy? Now, what I want to do in the next couple of slides is talk about some of the challenges that exist in the implementation of artificial intelligence in healthcare, and then end off with a little bit of a discussion to see, hopefully we'll be able to surmount some of those challenges, and if we can surmount them, what the future might look like in the hopefully not too distant future, because we do believe that there's a lot of opportunity for technology like this to be able to affect patient care in a very positive way. So let's first understand that there's some inherent limitations in the usage of AI. Okay, some very keen inherent limitations in the usage of AI. Part of it is that in order for us to be able to use AI in clinical practice, number one, it requires a lot of very clean data to be trained. It also requires a lot of repetition. Not always do we have the capability of being able to train algorithms with very clean data within AI. There's a lot of the discussions that are happening within the clinical community is not how can we implement artificial intelligence in clinical practice, but how can we actually train these algorithms in a way that we have good confidence that we're going to get the right results, that we can get the right automation using the data that's out there. Not only do we have the opportunity of doing lots of repetition as well, partially because some of the data sets are much smaller, and to do a diagnosis on a majority of clinical cases when we can already do diagnosis without using AI, things like chest x-rays, the question as to whether or not it would be worth it. The second thing is that there's an inherent limitation in the usage of AI because AI works very well when the rules of the game are very, very clearly understood. If you want to beat Kasparov in chess, well, there's a very well-defined set of rules for how it is that you play chess, a very controlled set of moves that each piece can actually do, and that doesn't change. Well, in the usage of AI for healthcare, there's so many different factors and so many different variants in clinical care, particularly when we're dealing with cancer, when we're dealing with patients with multiple comorbidities, that it makes it very hard to be able to get a really predictive algorithm out there in order to be able to predict how healthcare is going to be going. Which is why you start seeing articles like this, which was I subscribe to a number of different pieces of news. This is one of them from AI in Healthcare. And it's very interesting to note that on the very same day, you can have articles that talk about how AI can alter images, trick radiologists into misdiagnosing cancer patients, and then immediately after it, talk about how accurate AI can actually be in the clinical community. So you see dichotomies like this all the time, which means that we have to be very wary in a certain sense of the implementation of AI without really understanding what some of the limitations are. So for every step forward that we take, there's a number of steps that we could also take backwards before we really implement it into clinical care, and that's something that we need to be wary of. So what I'd like to do is review some of the challenges that we can take a look at for AI adoption, and try and see whether or not we might have a path to being able to surmount every one of them, or at least a way to address them and hopefully get us closer toward the revolution for AI in implementing clinical care that we'd like it to, and how that might be affecting in our clinical practice. So number one is, one of the challenges that we had spoken about was having unclear standards for algorithm training and adoption. So we just reviewed a couple of the limitations for AI, and in order for us to be able to train some of these algorithms properly, train these smart interventions, we need to have clear standards of what is clean data, what kind of training should we actually do, and where is it that the use cases make sense. So for instance, this was another article that happened just a week before this conference, where there's hundreds of CT scans that are going unread at a medical center, fueled by overworked radiologists, and that might be a great use case for the usage of AI in a controlled environment. But if you talk to another hospital, which is one of our partner hospitals, this is the University of Rochester, they're using a lot of the same algorithms and are just finding that it just adds to their time. And what it can actually do is point out potential findings that might not actually be clinically significant, and it just adds to their time because then they have to document it and then address every one of these computer-generated findings that might not have been something that they would have looked at beforehand. I remember sitting at a conference a little while ago, which is another radiology conference called the Society of Informatics and Imaging in Medical Care. And a lot of people asked the question, well, they presented clinical challenges and said, well, can I solve this with the AI? Can I solve that with AI? And a lot of my compatriots who were sitting on that panel talked to the wealth of opportunity that you could use to solve it. Whereas very often what I would do is challenge our customers back and some of the industry people back and say, do we really have to use some of these AI methodologies? Can we use standard bread and butter clinical practices to solve the problem without necessarily the implementation of AI? And in some cases, that would be better. So we have to really be cognizant and understand what are the standards for algorithm training and adoption, and when would be the best time to use it and when not. So let's take a look at a couple different stages of insight, because I think one of the best stages or best understandings of when we could use these algorithms might come from our friends at the FDA. So one could be using insights like this, or using technologies like this to get very specific disease insight. Okay, can we look at a cancer? Can we look at training a very specific cancer and understanding what that specific cancer, what it might look like, and how we can diagnose it? And that actually, I think, we're fairly okay at. The next question is can we make projections? Can we also make a projection to say that this cancer, if we do identify it, has a chance of being malignant? Or can we predict, the progression of cancer or this specific cancer in some way or other? Then it starts to get a little bit more dicey. Can we use these algorithms if we're looking more prospectively rather than just looking diagnostically? Taking a step beyond that, one of the key questions is that a lot of times the algorithms that we're using are trained by AI. They're trained by the methodologies of deep learning or continuous learning, but then they become static, meaning that they're implemented and trained once, but then they're not trained again. They're just used once they've actually been trained, and they become a black box. We send data to them, and then using the predetermined algorithm that is already frozen, they'll send back a response. But what's actually much more interesting is, can we continuously learn? One of the issues that that AI faced with, and what part of the reason why it had part of the slow progression, was because one of the earliest algorithms for AI that was trained was actually trained on cancer patients in a very specific area within Texas, whereas we tried to implement the findings of that AI-trained algorithm in places like Africa to diagnose cancer, and the patient populations can be vastly different. So can we have an algorithm that can continuously learn? And can we have an algorithm that would be more effective and almost train itself so that we don't have some of these roadblocks that we saw in some of the previous slides of where the algorithm can make a false potential prediction. So can we continuously learn is the next step. And then, the biggest hurdle that we'd love to all get to is, can we use AI not only for diagnosis, but can we also use it for negative predictability? Instead of saying on this particular slide or this particular image that there is cancer, can we say that this person looks normal, there is no cancer, therefore, can we trust the algorithm to say that the patient is healthy and then go on to diagnose other patients so we can spend our time more wisely with patients that might need a little bit more of our attention? And that's another high hurdle that we have to go over. Can we then give a level of holistic, insightful diagnosis? Can we take a look at other predictors? Instead of looking just at the image, can we factor in things like patient age, family history, other components that might be determinants of the progression of a disease, and go beyond that? And that becomes another level. And then can we get a little bit more predictive? Meaning, can we then start looking more at creating models as to whether or not a patient might get sick at some point in the future, even if they might not necessarily be sick now. So these are all different use cases, and I think for our purposes, we're still at the very early implementation stages of looking at things like that are disease specific. And if we take a look at the FDA as a guide for which algorithms they're starting to approve, what's actually interesting is, it might be a little bit hard to see on this slide, is that their actual implementations and their clearances of algorithms really only started just about a couple of years ago, where they're starting to take a look at AI seriously as something that can diagnose. And it's actually looking at that lowest, most level, very specific disease states, as something that we should be able to use as an adjunct, as something we can use to give us more insight for the diagnosis. But I think that the FDA recognizes that there's a lot of interest in this space. So what they've started to do is starting to fast track artificial intelligence approvals, where there's a precedent of looking at that lowest level of diagnosis, early diagnosis, or I would say early identification of disease. Still, the radiologist always has to give their insights, but not necessarily going beyond that. So we're still at early stages of at least coming up with the standards for how it is that these applications can be cleared for very limited and very specific use cases. But the FDA also recognizes that there's a need for ongoing learning. There's a need for looking at how these continuous learning applications can be approved. How should we look at them? And really, we're only at the stage where the FDA is beginning to start putting out discussion papers and seeking for insights for how it is that we can step beyond just looking at something that might be able to give us additional insights on imaging alone. Okay. The next thing I'd like to do is then talk about AI challenges in AI adoption. But there's lots of different multiple players in the market and a very highly fragmented market. When I showed you that RSNA floor, the show floor, essentially what you saw is multiple different players. There's over 130 different companies. It's hard to understand which algorithm should I implement and how should I put them into clinical practice. And that leads to the second challenge, which is how can I integrate all of those into my common clinical workflow. So, that AI and taking a look at that entire hall that we saw on one of the previous slides is really just a small part. If you look on the bottom right, that's medical imaging, and that's just a small part of the total potential of AI in healthcare, not even taking a look at all the other different potential applications, again, which might be looking very broadly at where that 6 billion in total, or 6.6 billion in total market potential might exist. That still seems like a bird in the tree rather than money in the hand, whereas some of these might be a little bit closer. But still, the question then for hospitals becomes, how do I decide which application I should use? So one of them, one of the ways that have been talked about is that there's a growth of various different access points. Okay, we also have implemented a my AI portfolio with the opportunity to launch what we call an AI workflow suite for the implementation of AI algorithms that either the hospitals have developed or from third parties or even some of our own into common clinical practice. But there's a lot of different markets out there that have begun to pop up. There's the Edison market from some of our friends that are even going beyond advanced visualization in clinical applications. There's looking at electronic medical records and other places like Nuance, which is reporting, where there's beginning to be much more of a marketplace opportunity out there. But a marketplace is great because it gives a potential access point to our radiology community, but it doesn't necessarily help them in terms of being able to choose or understand how it is that they should implement that into clinical practice. And that's why we at Philips in particular have started to look a little bit beyond just giving access to various different applications, to starting to think about how it is that we can curate the applications themselves, match those applications to the right, or match the right data types to the right application. Just because a person has cancer doesn't necessarily mean, or let's say lung cancer, it doesn't necessarily mean that if we're taking a CT image of the chest, that we shouldn't also potentially be looking for other usages of that same data set. I mean, if there's already a CT of the chest, why can't we also implement or take a look at cardiac algorithms if it's clinically indicated by their family history? So we're starting to look at how we can match and how we can better deploy some of these algorithms across all the different use cases. I mean, deployment is not just within the picture archiving systems and not just within the radiology workspace, but maybe even the users at the console, maybe the users who are at the scanner, and maybe even the referring physicians need to be have that access to that data at the right point. Then that's part of what we're looking at implementing with the AI workflow suite. So here we're looking at a way that we might be able to overcome some of the challenges in terms of having better integration into clinical workflow by getting it to the right area, and also having multiple players, but hopefully looking at ways that we can augment that data and analyze that data to make sure that it makes sense for that particular radiologist. The next question is then, are we getting acceptance by the clinical and IT community? Well, it seems like, there's over 300 clinical articles related to those articles that we saw at that radiology conference. So it seems like it's definitely beginning to get clinical acceptance. But I think one way that we can start to augment that clinical acceptance is by looking at two other determinants of whether AI is going to make it, and that is integration and partnership. And if we can combine integration and partnership together, that will hopefully drive for a greater adoption for AI. So let's take a look, first of all, at integration. One way that we can integrate all these smart algorithms is by building them almost seamlessly into an entire workflow. So this is our usage of smart algorithms and intelligent algorithms in a workflow for a lung nodule assessment that we built into our IntelliSpace portal, which is our advanced visualization platform, where we can use smart algorithms at every step along the way in order to be able to generate results, generate automated 3D pictures, projections of the heart, using semi-automated algorithms that have been trained using a lot of these methods, and even doing things like getting clinical decision support capabilities with things like data integration by using lung RAS or Fleischner guidelines, which are common guidelines for diagnosis of lung cancer that are built directly into the workflow. So the first thing is we can integrate a lot of these things into the workflow. And actually, Philips is looking to do that by being able to embed tools throughout the radiology workflow at every step along the way, and not just at every step along the way, but also taking a look at connecting the steps along the way so that we're not only getting better diagnosis for patients, but hopefully we're helpfully accelerating them throughout the patient care cycle. And we think that really the workflow implementations and the capabilities that you have to be able to speed a patient through the entire workflow is really one way that will help through integration the greater adoption of artificial intelligence algorithms. And the other way, as I mentioned, is also taking a look at this workflow suite, which is by orchestrating AI, making sure that we can get it cross-functional, bringing it to the point of integration at the point where it's needed the most. And I welcome for any of those who might be interested in learning a little bit more about our workflow suite that we can actually hopefully give you a little bit more of an understanding of how we integrate. The next phase is to actually drive for partnership. As we talk about partnership and finding ways to collaborate, One way that we'll make sure that AI is going to be adopted a little bit more is to partner with organizations like the ACR, okay, which is what we call the American College of Radiology, where they've created a data science institute centered around AI algorithms, so that we can start to explore questions that are really important for the adoption, like, is there an ethics behind AI, and can we use AI ethically in order to help diagnose patients, and really explore those questions with a lot of the industry experts, and not just do it on a hospital-by-hospital basis. And that's why you see a lot of people within the industry, like NVIDIA and GE Healthcare, starting to really have, and us as well, having a lot of these collaborations with the American College of Radiology and others, in order to try and make sure that when we're implementing this AI, that we're doing it in a way that will be accepted by the clinical community and the IT community around the world. Another way is to be able to take a look at challenges, which really are put out by organizations like the RSNA to help us to challenge ourselves and to see, can we really solve certain problems. And if we're taking a look at one that was created for 2019 for intracranial hemorrhage detection, there's lots of different methods. And when the RSNA is creating challenges like this, they're welcoming budding students and hospitals to employ various different methods and see which one might work best to be able to diagnose very important diseases in conjunction with these with the radiology community, as opposed to kind of going at it as a wildfire. And finally, another way to be able to get better implementation is to work in discovery. And there's a lot of platforms for research that help us in implementing AI, testing AI, and making sure that we're comparing ourselves to standards. The last thing I'd like to go through is the final challenge in AI adoption is to get validated financial value and business modeling. And this is actually a talk I'm going to give at the HIMSS conference in just a little bit, because it doesn't seem like there's a very common metric for how it is that we should be looking at AI and what the financial benefits are for the hospital yet. A lot of people posit, potential metrics like decrease in wait time or decrease in radiologist time, but there aren't very common metrics. We're looking at various different algorithms. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have a commonality in comparing one application to the next. So the suggestion that I have is to take a look at AI holistically. Don't just look at it from the standpoint of how much time this is going to cost or save a radiologist. It really should be looked at as, how much more bandwidth am I going to be required at the hospital? What are the training metrics that I'm going to need? What's the upkeep of this? How much data is it going to need to be trained? And then if we take a systematic view, only then run the numbers. Okay? So look at it not only in terms of the benefits of the radiologist, but going even beyond that and going beyond. So if we take a look at all these challenges, it seems like we're, the light at the end of the tunnel is getting further and further away. But I'd like to just recap, and it seems like we actually have certain ways to start surmounting some of these challenges. Number one is to have clear purpose and understanding of what you'd be doing with AI. Think about it very carefully within the clinical setting. Not all use cases are the same. It might make sense to use AI in some cases and some not. And if we have a clear understanding, it'll hopefully give us a clear understanding of how to implement AI, what are the limitations, and hopefully not have some of the stumbling blocks that will require us to take a couple steps back when we do that. The second thing is to think very carefully about workflow integration. AI itself is just a byline. All it is just a set of technologies that can be used to augment a host of different capabilities. To the degree that we can get it workflow integrated, and we've talked about a couple of tools, is the degree to which it's going to increase in its capabilities. A lot of those papers that you see at the RSNA and others are talking about very specific applications, but not necessarily looking at it from a whole patient perspective and looking at the different capabilities within the patient. And that's one way that we need to be able to do it. The third is through ongoing partnership with industries like ACR, the American College of Radiology, and the RSNA, to make sure that when we're doing this, we're doing it in conjunction with the clinical community, and we can see that there's a lot of uptake in that area. And then finally, define your financial metrics and try and get commonality in how it is that you're analyzing these technologies, and hopefully that'll get us there. So if I take a look at, where it is that we can imagine that we're going to go, and I'll just have two more slides. Hopefully I can cover that within the 5 minutes we have left. I think this is the area that I think we're going to start seeing the progression of AI in the clinical community. Number one is that we're going to start seeing it not only within very particular applications, but more and more we're hearing customers talking about the necessity and need for us to look more holistically, combining various different scanning modalities in the electronic medical record and trying to combine patient data in images with text and labs and look at it throughout the entire patient care pathway and figure out ways that we can actually advance the patient throughout rather than looking at very specific use cases. It seems like there's a plethora of different algorithms that are all looking at lung cancer screening, and I don't think all of those are going to survive. The AI that's going to survive is going to look more operationally, look more integrative, and look at the financial metrics and all the capabilities of being able to advance the patient rather than just giving insight at one particular spot. The next thing that if I could have a couple predictions of where we think the future of AI is going to be based off of all this knowledge would be, number one, I believe that the proliferation of use cases that are specific algorithms for lung cancer screening or intracranial hemorrhage is probably going to slow. The clinical interest will continue to increase because there's a lot of interest in the usage of these algorithms, but there's a lot of them already out there, and there's a lot of good ones. And rather than having just another intracranial hemorrhage application, I think people are going to start looking more holistically at use cases. And when they look at marketplaces, they're going to start pitting these applications one against the other, and we'll start to understand which ones will rise to the top. And then those that will look to increased usage of AI are really going to look more towards operational metrics and not just operational, but clinical operations. So that's what I see. I think that a lot of the interest is going to shift to continuously learning apps as well. I think that people are going to start to recognize that applications that are trained by AI in a black box are great, but when they start bouncing it against their data, are going to come across potential limitations, and people are going to start looking for the opportunity of being able to learn on their own data set and learn progressively as time will go on. And the FDA is showing interest in that area, so of course we should as well. Again, as I mentioned, I think that there's going to be a much more increase to focus on workflow, integration, reporting, building entire workflows for particular disease states rather than diagnosing at only one spot. We start seeing this already with GE, for instance, which is talking about looking at an entire stroke suite of applications rather than individual applications to start giving a more holistic package. The other thing is that I also believe the patient insights from various data sources, we're going to start looking a little bit more at combining data, looking at genomics as well, looking at not just the imaging, but starting to think about how it is, that once we've gone beyond the image, what else can we do with data? Can we then, if we're using that, as I brought the example of talking about lung cancer, can we use that same data set for other things? If we know that there's a potential a history of cardiac disease, can we be more predictive using things like family history and genomics and trying to catch diseases before they happen? So, of course, I think that access to applications rather than being a wild west of various different companies is going to be more consolidated through enterprise-backed marketplace models, which we'll see a little bit more of. There's going to be some caveats in there in terms of how they'll be used and trained, and how they should be implemented in the workflow. And I also believe that, with all the back and forth that we've kind of been seeing, I believe that we're actually at a tipping point for adoption. But just because we're at a tipping point doesn't mean that it's going to expand exponentially in a common clinical practice. I think that it's going to be a road of looking at use case by use case, looking at understanding how these applications are going to affect patient care, and only then move on. Until we can rationalize the financial metrics for financial implementation. So part of the issue is that there's a lot of clinical interest, but there aren't that many real defined use cases of people saving money. Everybody understands that rationally this makes sense to implement, but I was actually speaking with a friend of mine, Terry Madelon from one of the hospitals on the East Coast, from Einstein, and they actually use AI quite a bit within their clinical practice, and he was saying that it's quite clear that it does save them time, that it does save them, it catches certain things that they might have missed, but they're not sure exactly which clinical or what financial metrics to measure that by and see how we can get broader adoption across the hospital. And for that, we can start seeing that there's a lot of, as I mentioned, Terry has his own experience in the radiology department, and it definitely shows that there is benefit, but until we get common metrics, it'll be harder for us to get that implementation. And I bring the example of looking at 3D printing, that if we overshoot and talk about expectations without really realizing the financial model, it might backfire a little bit upon us. So I really think that we're getting to the point where, way into the future, we'd like to get to the point where we're looking at digital twins and using AI to really predict where disease states are going to go. I'm excited by that capability. I think that we'll get there at some point in the future, but I think that there's a ways ahead of us. And even if we're at the tipping point and getting to the point where we start seeing the adoption will grow. The market expectations are broader, and we should take that a little bit with a grain of salt and start looking at particular use cases in radiology and in others, understand what that market might look like for that particular use case, and then understand the adoption metrics, the financial metrics, and the clinical metrics that are going to get us there. So thanks for your attention. I hope this was informative, and I'd like to maybe, Mark, open it up for discussion with you and then take a couple questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was an absolutely terrific presentation. I really appreciate it. It was super informative. I have a couple of thoughts I would like to just share and we can discuss. It was interesting. First of all, did you know about the American College of Radiology and its current initiative around creating they've created basically a collaborative in which several academic medical centers are co-developing AI algorithms for diagnostics. Were you at all aware of that?
Of course. So sure. I mean, they've partnered with Stanford and other hospitals as well. Sure.
Right. Exactly. And I think that for what you were saying, and I agree absolutely, this idea of just kind of one-off development, I mean, it could take 30,000 years for a good, library of diagnostic algorithms to really fully develop otherwise. So I think that'll be one thing. It was interesting that when I was at RSNA, there a press release came out in which a new study published in the journal Radiology found that AI can actually clinically detect meaningful chest X-ray findings as effectively as experienced radiologists. So it's kind of an interesting complex dynamic, I think, that we're going through.
Yeah. So Mark, what's interesting is for every article that you see like that, and there's been previous articles like that also talked about diagnosing pneumonia better than radiologists can. So that's one example. We're starting to see it as well from chest X-rays as well. I don't think anybody in the clinical community would rely yet on AI to negatively diagnose, meaning, to give them more insights, definitely, but then to say that this patient is fine and then move on to the next patient, I don't think radiologists are yet in that area. The other thing is that for every, what you're not seeing in the press are the failed attempts, right? There's very often, you take a look at ontmini.com and you'll see lots of different articles that point to the opposite, that if we're not training these algorithms properly, then they can lead to vastly different results. So again, we have to be very careful about the use cases. It might diagnose in a very specific population set, but that doesn't necessarily mean that trained AI algorithm that dealt with a small population in New Jersey is going to be predictive of Latin American populations, African populations, or European populations as well.
Right, exactly. I'm with you 100%. I just find it interesting that all these different little paths, people are going down different paths for different reasons. It was interesting. I'll say one other thing, and then we have an important question from our audience. But it was interesting because I sat in on several clinical sessions, and what they most at RSNA, and you and I have talked about this, but I think it's interesting that some of the work list optimization based alerts created through AI are starting to get traction ahead of the purely diagnostic ones. And if you could just comment on that.
Sure. So actually what's interesting about those work lists is that a lot of them are driven by diagnostic AI, or basically by looking at the imaging and then moving people or moving a case higher up on the work list, right? So that's part of
Okay.
what's actually driving to that. There are some others that are driven by the patient context, but things like the electronic medical record, but a lot of that is being driven by just analyzing the imaging. So now, that's interesting, and of course people are looking at that. We also have capabilities like that. But then it becomes a question, if you have multiple different AI algorithms running on the same data set for a patient with multiple comorbidities, do you bump them higher up the list? Maybe if you're running two AI algorithms, one of them shows negative predictability, the other one shows positive, where do you place them on the list? And also, just because you happen to have somebody who's been diagnosed with lung cancer, and that should likely get them higher up on the list, it still doesn't surpass people that would be diagnosed by intracranial hemorrhage or even a suspect intracranial hemorrhage. So you have to be careful. It's true that there's a lot of opportunities to be able to do workflow optimizations, but I don't think we've yet realized all the different potential use cases and thought through where those optimizations make sense, what are the trade-offs that we need to be able to make them do that. So it's great we're exploring different avenues. I think we're in the divergent stage of understanding the possibilities, and we need to converge a little bit before we get to clinical practice.
And I agree with you. We have time for one question from the audience that I'd like to give to you, and then I'll have to close up. So you can take a luxurious 2 minutes answering this. The audience member asks, who are the most resistant in an organization to AI? Is it physicians or administrators in hospital systems? That's a little bit of a broad question.
No, but it's an interesting one, and I think it's time-based. So if we take a look at, just a year and a half or 2 years ago, a lot of articles were out there for clinical resistance to AI, right? People believed that AI was going to replace the radiologist, that, we were going to have the Star Wars surgeons doing surgery that were all robotic. And I think we've actually surpassed that at this point. I don't think that people are, I think most people in the clinical community are coming to the understanding that, that the common adage is that those that will be replaced are those that don't necessarily embrace. And those that embrace find the right ways to embrace, and will find the ways to be able to get even better by doing that. So I think that there's less concern in the clinical community. What I'm starting to see is actually a lot more concern in the hospital finances and the IT community. So IT in particular, there's a lot of data that has to trade hands and move around within the hospital. And that creates a lot of network latency and bandwidth. There's potential patient safety issues with how it is that these data are being transferred. And people are talking about the potential of sending data up to a cloud for analysis. And that becomes an IT concern and a hospital operations concern. And the second thing is also who's going to pay for all this, right? So until there's very well-defined clinical metrics, stronger radiologists have made a case for the implementation of AI within their hospitals. But if you're talking about a low-budget hospital that has to make their numbers, particularly those that don't have, incredibly high radiology turnaround time or rate, they can, they're not level 1 trauma centers, let's say. The case is a lot harder at the level of the C-suite. So I think, it has to be a collaborative effort looking at, does it make sense for the hospital at this point, and maybe dip their toe in the water of understanding the use cases before anything else. I think that those are the more resistance in the hospital. Maybe we take one more, and then we'll close off.
That was our final question from the audience.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
What I can ask you is any last thoughts in terms of, oh, wait, there's one more. So you can take one more. What can AI solution companies do to overcome the hesitation or resistance by those parties?
So, I work for one of those companies. And I think, again, as I mentioned, I think partnership and collaboration, I think, is a very strong way to be able to help overcome resistance. I think that in the early stages, like we're trying to do with our IntelliSpace AI workflow platform, is to work together with the hospitals, not only to sell an algorithm or implement or put an algorithm in practice, but to work thinking a little bit more holistically. How does this work within their workflow? How does this work? Which applications would they be more interested in using? It takes a bit of working together, and every case is going to be a little bit different. So I think it's a general answer, but I think it's also we're in a stage where we're looking. We need to tailor a little bit more to the needs in the hospital. We're not generalists just yet.
Well, I really appreciate that response. And I want to thank you for a tremendous presentation. It was loaded with information and insights. So thank you so much, Kevin. I
Sure.
really appreciate it. I know our audience does. So unfortunately,
Sure.
that's all the time we have for today. Oh, did you want to say something? I apologize.
No, for all those who are still asking questions, I'd be happy to send my email out there for those who are still asking questions. I'd be happy to continue the conversation offline. I'm passionate about it. I'd be happy to continue for those interested in reaching out to me.
Great. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Once again, I'd like to thank Kevin for a terrific webinar presentation, and I'd like to thank our sponsor, Philips, for making today's program possible. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us in the future for another Healthcare Innovation webinar. This concludes today's presentation. Have a great day.